Hey everybody, let's hope this is recording. Let me make sure it says it is. Fingers crossed. I still worry about that every time. Okay, so yeah, sorry last week for the delay on some of the things we were doing. I think I've adjusted to the schedule okay now. But if you have any questions or if you have any different needs or whatever, let me know. So we're going to be working through this slide deck for the next 3 weeks, I think. So we're going to cover sensation and perception, basics of cognition, and decision-making information processing. So again, some of this might be review for some of the folks from have a human factors background or a psychology background. But otherwise, I hope it's still useful and fun to go through and we get some good conversations out of it. Let me start there, okay. So the next couple weeks, yeah, this is what we're going to be going through is the psychological foundations of human factors and why we do what we do as people. Trying to understand people over the product. So if you're at a point where you're designing something, it's very, very easy to get caught up in the design or in the thing that you're designing. A lot of us will work on some pretty cool design things for careers, but it's important to remember that the people are what matter. That's what we're here to do. And keep in mind in general, when we get into sensation and perception, cognition, decision making, a lot of these are unlearned and fixed characteristics. Not like everybody has the same memory limits or attention spans or whatever, but in general, our eyes all work relatively the same, our hearing works the same, and how we think works the same. So keep that in mind as well. These aren't necessarily things that you can train or proceduralize out of a person. Going over slacks just from the last week. So these are just some of the points I picked out of everybody's comments, their individual posts and everything there. So let's see. So with the conversation about car lights on the dash, I despise the color red. So I would not like my dash to be red. But I also understand that it is tricky, especially now that you have like street lights where some of them are the old orange lights and then some are the new LEDs. You combine those with different headlight bulbs or undercarriage lighting, different things like that. It does get kind of hard to deal with all of that. I actually, I can't remember where I saw it, but I remember a write up or an article or something on how the LED lights were actually having a impact on ecosystems because it was bothering the animals for similar reasons. So, yeah, that's definitely a concern for sure. And how that is an ergonomic concern as we get into more digital displays. You know, if you're in a dark, if you're driving at night, how do you balance that light? What color of the light do you use? And those kind of characteristics. There were some comments on nuclear and ergonomics. So nuclear does, ergonomics is a big focus. So I work at the INL. We have ergonomics people that do ergonomic assessments all the time. One thing, there was a comment about the control room layouts and those designs. That definitely probably was a concern when a lot of these plants were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But just it's been 50 years since a lot of those plants were constructed. So doing an ergonomic eval on them now isn't necessarily super useful because if you find problems, it's okay, well, we're not going to change it. There are some interesting things I had, read. I heard the TMI, so 3 Mile Island, had this kind of a problem, but I'm not certain. I haven't ever went back to the reports to verify, but where you do have key lock switches. So like you'll see on TV when they're going to launch a missile, you have to put your key in and turn the lock. That is a real thing, especially in nuclear. And there was, I seem to recall a story where someone put their key in the lock, and then there was a second key lock switch that needed to be activated, and there was a delay in activating it, because they were putting in the key and turning it the wrong direction. The key locks were actually set up to turn opposite directions. So let's say the one on first one, the operator went to turn to the right, the other one turned to the left, or vice versa. And that is a problem because you're reversing that physical function. So that's an interesting concern too. Lighting is a big problem because especially, if you're doing emergency things, one of the most common emergency scenarios that we'll talk about and the just industry supports and talks about is station blackout, or SBO. And that's when your nuclear power plant loses offsite power. That's another thing it can be called, is loss of offsite power. And so you have your reactor system is still running. Your reactor, the core is still hot and those things. And so your immediate emergency step is to get eyes on the core and on the reactor vessel, which they don't necessarily mean go and look at it. They mean trying to get power, whether it's generators or backups or other things, to your instrument panels so that you can see what's going on. And then right after that, it is about core cooling. So maintaining that you have feed water still running and those kind of things. Those are your critical functions that you need to support. But in that instance, there's another concern of what about the lights? Most of nuclear power plants have sodium lighting for emergencies, and so that's not great lighting. So that's definitely a concern when you look at these old yellow or green bland control boards, no real digital backlights, that's a trick there to look at. And just moving around the room, that's a concern. So, and inherited problems I put here is an important one because, again, there's I don't remember the plant, but there's a plant somewhere where there is some main steam pipe that is used that runs kind of right in the middle of the control room. So you have to navigate around that to get to the other side. Obviously, that's an ergonomic problem, but if that's the way your system has to be set up, what are you going to do if you can't really reroute it? So that's a lot of the nuclear ergonomics problems, especially the age of facilities and making do with what you have because you can't change it for one reason or another. The analog and digital thing comes up. It'll come up constantly as we go through stuff, but digital ergonomics versus analog, you don't have to have a giant board or a room full of different control boards. If you have a really big monitor or something, you can scroll through things. Digital designs have that lack of space demands that's important. And color-coded control areas, this is another interesting idea. So I did a human-computer interaction training for a couple operations guys from Mexico. And they have a plant where their boards look festive almost, like they have a lot of color on their boards, not in the buttons or switches, but in the actual panels. They've kind of painted areas in so that you kind of know if you're looking at a switch that's within a group or not. It's just a standard grouping mechanism. But because they're so big, they definitely reuse colors, which is a problem. But the reason they did that is because in a semi-emergent situation, I don't recall what the scenario was. An operator or your senior reactor operator, told the RO, the reactor operator on shift, to go and open a valve. And he opened the valve one too far to the left, which actually did something to a completely separate system. And they ended up having some issues there, some mechanical failures as a result. So that was their solution. So that's an example of sometimes the optimal solution is impossible. So you bust out spray paint and paint your control room. So there's that's kind of the biggest thing with nuclear. Ergonomics is critical because you know as much as possible, because you need to be able to actually do the work, but also keep in mind these are 50, 60, 70-year-old facilities, and in a lot of cases are not changeable. So it's kind of a push-pull there. Nuclear standards. So there was a conversation in there about design standards and specific, and then nuclear standards. So what's been my experience with nuclear standards is that they are treated relatively as gospel in some sense. So, there's a certain reason why we do X, Y, and Z. That makes a ton of sense when you get into the engineering of nuclear, because we've learned over decades how these systems work best and how they work most efficiently and different things like that. But when you get into human design standards, um, they are it's an interesting one because they're not born of aesthetics at all. They have very little interest how something works or if it's pleasing to interact with or look at. Instead, what they're concerned about is its use and its function. But historically, human factors has always been the second on that list. The key is engineering the system, and then you fit the human factors. You fit the human to the system with some adjustments, but not always very much. So that's kind of a concern there. Now, when you deviate, kind of depends on who you ask. The NRC does not like you to deviate from nuclear standards without some good reason, and they have the final say on a lot of those adjustments. So you do kind of have to do your homework if you are going to deviate, which so New Reg 0700 is the biggest design standard that exists in nuclear. It gives us guidance on color, fonts, those things. Not in the sense of like a style guide where it's saying, our fonts we're going to use Arial 12 point or whatever. It doesn't do that. Instead, it talks in broad concepts about different systems, switches, functions, interactions, things like that. But also, it generally comes across with if you need to deviate, you can just have a good reason and back it up. That's the biggest thing in nuclear. It's very, very hard to do research on human system interfaces that's generalizable within nuclear because there's not that many licensed operators and they're really, really expensive to get their time. And because they're licensed for only one plant, sometimes they don't have a lot of experience in other things, or you can only test one particular system. So those are concerns there. But if you are going to deviate, you have to do your homework. You have to do your task analysis, your function allocation, and your function requirements analysis, do an operating experience review, do actual operator in the loop testing. And after all of that, you back it up enough, and then you should be all right in terms of the regulator. The struggle that I've seen in some of the work we've done is sometimes your stakeholders just won't like it. So you still always have the oh no, I don't like that color type thing, or I want it with a black background instead of a gray or something. So that's still there. Now, design standards are extremely useful in the traditional design sense of determining like fonts and hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. I had a other meltdown. Okay, let's see. Back into the slideshow. Okay, so let's see. We were talking about design standards. So one nice thing about having your font, color, those things dictated is consistency. So especially in digital design, one thing you'll hear me talk about a lot is ubiquitous computing. So digital design is heavily, heavily influenced now by all other digital designs. So, if you're going to create a website with a novel navigation, that's all well and good, but you have to have some very good reasons to do that and some really good signposting because people have expectations. And it automatically creates a slightly more negative experience. Similar if you were to walk into a building that had really novel architectural components or something, but let's say the doors didn't have any handles and no real explanation as to what you were going to do, that people generally don't like to feel confused or stupid. So that's one of the biggest reasons why we want to do that, because we've kind of been taught that uh, digital system will have a regular font, and anytime it deviates from that, it's important. I think titles versus body of text, or um, the required fields in a form. There's a lot of different instances where we will have uh, those kind of required standards. So that's an important thing to kind of adhere to. But then again, if you have a situation where the adopted design standard sucks, then yeah, that's worth it to change that, but make sure you change it consistently. Then there's another question in there about related ergonomics, how to keep people happy, safe, and productive. Um, I'd say that's almost like one of those pick two situations. If even that, it really depends on the situation. That's the goal. In nuclear, your number one is safety. Your number two is productive. Happy is probably number 76. So it's again, it's a lot. I think, and I would guess a lot of process control or public utility style work is kind of that way. It's such a critical thing that it's more about just getting it done versus it being a pleasant experience. So um, that's kind of most of the points that I pulled down there. And then this week, yeah, we'll have more. That's actually, I think, the next slide. Yep. So yeah, comment, respond, communicate, just have a dialogue. That's kind of one of the best experience I had in an online class during my master's was one where the Slack was pretty active. So and engage, because some of these people might be in other classes that you will take, or want to be on a hiring committee for you. You just never know. So it's good to always just have those conversations. For this week, so these are the kind of questions on Slack. So I want you to make a post and then comment on someone else's post. And after that, it's kind of a free for all, whatever you guys want to do. So, what are some common examples of bad design that relate to the things we talk about this week? So, we already talked about some issues or things that we just don't like in design, different instances or things that we struggle with. Um, where we're focusing on sensation and perception this week is mainly just sensation and perception. What are some examples of bad design that, let's say, offend your senses or your perception mechanisms? And it's something relatively common. And then, you probably have an idea of how to fix it in your mind, but uh, instead comment on somebody else's post with a proposed suggestion of how to fix it. And be creative. It doesn't have to be uh, aligned with any kind of human factors, principles, or whatever, aside from it should be reasonably thought out. It should make it better. We definitely don't want to make it worse. Keep in mind things like accessibility, various populations that might use your system or whatever, or your suggestion. So um, that's kind of what I want you guys to focus on there. Obviously, Nathan's comment about the dash lights is an example of one that affects your visual system. So uh, there's a lot of those other ones that are important to keep in mind. And then I'll try to jump in on a couple of them too. I wasn't able to last week, but I'm gonna make an effort to do that there. Okay, so this will start the sensation and perception section. I just wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Dyer. He was a professor in the Human Factors program that passed away last year. At least I feel like it was like 2020 really messed with my sense of time. So it was either 2019 or early 2020. And he was the primary sensation and perception professor and was phenomenal. So I hope I can do a tenth of his abilities justice. So okay, when we're talking about perceptual processing, what we're mainly talking about is something comes into your mind, you need to handle it, interact with it in some way. You then retrieve an idea and something happens. You take an action, you're blending it, you're aligning with the schema. There's a lot of different things that we'll go through over the next couple weeks. But that's primarily what we're looking at. Some of the main focus areas we're going to talk about are sensation and perception, information processing, decision making, and taking action after that. So sensation, and the terms can be relatively interchangeable. Don't get caught up on those. But initially, what we're talking about is the gathering of information via sense organs: eyes, ears, touch, taste, smell, all those things. We're looking, and it's what all those systems are doing is they're transferring environmental, physical characteristics or stimuli that we're interpreting into electrochemical signals that our brain can act on. So just like this example of, we're receiving information of a person about to bite into a popsicle. Our next thing, we're going to go to perception. So what do we perceive about that? What are our takeaways from that sensory information? So that's where we get into mental representations. Do we recognize this instance? If it is, do we have an example to compare it to, kind of ideal instance, or we've been in this situation before, so therefore it kind of gives us a script to follow for what's next. Or if it's novel, it gets encoded and stored in memory. And that's where we start to develop our action plans. Those are the scripts. And most things we do in life have a script, whether we are conscious of it or not. For example, the script that I have learned through life is somebody who bites a popsicle is a bad person and not to be trusted. Recognition. So this is so when you're matching whatever representation you're getting from the world to information in long-term memory. This is also, we'll get into it in cognition a little bit in schemas. So when you're looking at a line, you walk into a store or into some public area, there is a line. Little kids don't know anything about lines. They don't know where to walk or anything. But over time, we learn kind of the action plan, the rules of that situation. That's what we're talking about with recognition, or the rules of the situation, or the rules of the characteristic. Everything from how you handle different balls. Let's say, we physically handle a basketball different than maybe a soccer ball and a football and those kind of things. And those are learned behaviors that we've developed over interacting with these physical objects and developing those mental representations of them. The two primary pathways of influence are bottom-up and top-down processing. So bottom-up is definitely the earlier one. That's when the information that you are receiving is going to influence your perceptual processing. When we're looking for danger, when we're looking for change, things that are out of place, in the sense of like, I was looking over here. I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, the easiest one is always like object permanence for babies, where something is now gone and therefore it is gone. But essentially, bottom-up processing is when the stimuli we're receiving influences our perceptual processing, our representations, and higher handling of that information. Top-down is the opposite. It is we have physical stimuli hitting our sensors, and we have a preconceived notion or a schema or a recognized instance that we are going to understand that stimuli within biases, heuristics, those kind of things. Anytime the first time that I saw a 2-lane drive-through was one of those great instances of trying to do top-down processing, failing, and then having to pivot to bottom-up just to understand, okay, how's this thing going to work? So that's kind of some examples of those. So bottom-up, we're looking at, you're looking at a pattern of neural activity in the brain, and as that stimuli is coming in, you're interacting with that stimuli, you're just constantly getting more sense information, your representation is being constructed in your brain to eventually be stored in memory. Gives rise to a subjective experience. This is important to note that all of these are inherently subjective. All of our kind of perceptions about things are, in the sense of they are only from our perspective. We don't get to see what our friends or neighbors, how they process information outside of if they tell us. So that's another thing to keep in mind with your users or things you're designing. Everybody's going to have a subjective experience about that. Nuclear's response to that has been heavy training and procedural focuses where you can give everybody the same subjective experience or as close as possible to try to unify that. Top down. So this is an example. I actually stole this from one of my coworkers of how top down processing can work. So you have an expectation. She has cats, so an expectation that there is a cat. So distal stimulus, just as the light reflecting off an object. So it gives us information that there's something there. From there, we're able to interpret that stimulus into a proximal stimulus, send it up to our brain, but the speed and accuracy of recognizing the situation you're in is influenced from the information in your environment and your pre-existing notion of what that environment should look like, what your expectation is. When those align closely, you will have pretty high speed and accuracy of recognition. But if there's some different things, let's say she walked into her house and saw a dog toy on the floor, that immediately might break this top-down processing because it's such a jarring piece of information that it makes you rethink everything. And obviously there's a spectrum there between what would trigger it or not. So now object recognition is, that's one of the earliest things we learn. There's primarily three characteristics that we use to define objects and to understand them and be familiar with them. That's function, structure, and ownership. And ownership is not what you're thinking with, it's my toy or my car or anything. But also image clutter is another big one for that. Usually there are certain objects in a instance, or by instance, I mean in a visual representation, a picture in a scene that will pop out more than others. And most people will have different things that pop out. That's why, unless it's something that's high contrast, high salient, so we're thinking like fire hydrants and those kind of objects. So that's something to keep in mind there. In nuclear, it's highly important because, again, we're dealing with situations where not a lot of undo or takebacks on actuating a system. So you need to ensure that you are in the right spot, doing the right thing on the right piece of equipment. So it's pretty critical for those things. Just basic objects recognition. Object variety is between or within. So the easiest way to think about that is so recognizing the variety of objects, let's say the variety of dogs within the broader scope of dogs. So that'll be, okay, I have a Boston Terrier. My neighbor has German Shepherds. I recognize they're both dogs, but there's variety between them within that group. Sorry, I'm messing with the terms here. In between, though, I also fundamentally understand that a dog is different than a shoe or something. Those are how that, and we understand that we build those assessments there. Variable views are another thing that we do pretty well. This is one of the tricky things, right, with image processing algorithms, is how do you interpret, how do you teach a computer that, no, this really is the same bridge, we're just looking at it from different angles? Like, that's a tricky thing there. And one thing that human visual processing does really, really well is we can extrapolate a scene from various perspectives and still relatively come away with a similar gist. Recognizing visual objects in general. So we're looking at perceptual organization, so location, orientation, and curvature. These are things that will determine what an object is and where it lives in space. Curves, edges is the big takeaway here. Edges are primarily important. And the reason why, shown there at the bottom with the 50s and the 75s, ignore those numbers. But what it's essentially showing is those are like activation levels of your visual system. So certain areas of your visual system are perceiving that one area is darker than the other. So therefore it senses an edge and it can scribe that in the space and start to understand where that edge is. So that is how that's how our visual system processes something round or that's shaped oddly or from a different perspective. We can see those angles and kind of walk back that way. And similarly, when we're seeing something from a different perspective, we have a pretty good ability at thinking and visualizing what it is from the right perspective and making us educated guess on what we're looking at. So more recognition of visual objects. So distal stimulus. So these are just 4 different examples of the same stimulus from different perspectives of visual systems. So distal stimulus, so the cup or bowl is reflecting light. All edges are real and apparent. The regions will be represented by your visual system as shown there in the bottom left. You will start to see areas of light, shadow, those characteristics there. And then we're able to then understand, our brain interprets, okay, yes, we got some shadow, we've got some light, we've got different things there. We understand this is a bowl that is having a shadow. We think we could be wrong. It could be a bowl sitting on a black spot, painted to look like a shadow. But our history, our life, our experiences have taught us that that's actually pretty unlikely. And so we can be pretty fairly certain that what we're pulling out of it's correct. Figure ground organization. So figure and ground, essentially try to ignore the literal aspects of it. When you're looking at a scene, figures are things that pop out or are closer to you, and ground is everything else. Anything that isn't a figure is by definition the ground. So what do we see in these images that kind of help us understand that? You see the shadow of the woman, you see her standing in front of the picture at various points. Notice the difference between A and C. Without that shadow on A, you're not really looking for it. Somebody could possibly mistake. And if you try to focus, you can usually trick your visual system this way. You might be able to make it look like that picture's in front of her. Those are ways that we can manipulate our visual system. Object on the right, somebody playing a saxophone or a woman's face. It really just depends on which side you look at. There are some general rules that we'll get into of how our brains identify those, but they're not necessarily hard and fast all the time. Different people will see different things. But in general, we can make some claims on those. And I just already covered this. So when we talk about ownership, right, that was something we talked about on the main slide there. We're talking about owning the border. That means they are the ones that are the primary object in that image, which means they, from a cognitive angle, they by definition and by default get the highest amount of attention immediately, because that's just the way our visual system processes things that are close, things that are salient, things that are moving, that stand out from a background. Some more figure ground stuff. So surroundedness and symmetry are both things that will determine what owns the border. Remember, we talk about something owning the border, that also means that it should be the thing that you notice. So that you notice first. So on the top image there, do you notice the black box with the cutout, or do you notice a white object in the middle of black? Typically, so the reason that, at least for me and probably most of you, the white pops out is because it is surrounded. So it is considered to be more salient, or that it is in front of something. Our brain's making a guess there that behind that white thing would be more black. And and it's blocking it in some way. Symmetry is also one that will govern it. So if you have symmetrical borders, they usually will blur around in the back. Because again, if you have two symmetrical borders that are away from each other, they have some distance between each other, then the assumption is there's something in between them that matters. So you should focus on that primarily, and the rest can be ground. Not like it's not important, but it is not the thing that's going to pop out immediately. Convexity. So this is a fun one too. When you look down there, this is one you can usually make your visual system see one or the other. So do you see thorny branches or twisty cords? The convex borders are more likely to be seen as figure versus ground. I've always wondered if this is because we have so little convex objects in the world naturally that it's not something that we are designed to see, designed to see as just part of our everyday life. So it's somewhat abnormal in that way. Keep in mind, a lot of the evolutionary background for this is to see abnormality for defense or safety to protect from predators. So, meaningfulness, this is one of those things where when you're looking at these, if you recognize one of the two objects, or if it that therefore means gives it meaning, you will see it more than the other. Those are some examples there that kind of tell that story, and are really interesting, weird quirks of our visual system. And this is one too where as we start to perceive things, how would you describe the object in A, where we're looking at? To me, it is a light bar, horizontally, light blue. Below that is a vertical darker blue bar, and below that is an object that is red. So to me, I see the light blue first. And then the B, these are just different examples of ways to perceive things, and what do you see first and why? And why do you think you see that? Because remember, your perception and your recognition or how you interact with this object from a visual system perspective isn't wrong. It can't be. It's what you interact with. So try to explain why. Why do you see things that way? Because sometimes there's some interesting takeaways there, especially as you get users and they see things in a completely different way than you do. And you can kind of try to, make sense of that and take and step into their shoes a little bit. But always keep in mind the perception of reality is never wrong. Not to say like, a lot of things right now in this time of, in this current state, I guess we're all in as a society, there's a lot of differences of reality, but we're talking about when you see a fence, how you see the fence is not wrong. It's just different than everybody else's, which is all right, because all theirs is are different too. So perceptual grouping, Gestalt psychology, we'll get into Gestalt stuff a lot later, but these are pretty common, what we would call Gestalt principles of design too, which when you design things, you want to try to stick with these. You don't want to try to violate them. When things are abnormal here, so let's say you had a see there, the similarity of color, 2 red, 2 blue, 2 red, 2 blue. If the next one was 1 yellow and then 2 red, 2 blue, 2 red, 2 blue, that 1 yellow one would really stand out. Not because yellow is more salient than red or blue naturally, just because it breaks our expectation. And the way our visual system perceives the world is things that don't flow as expected, they don't follow patterns, or those things are the ones that will stand out. Perceptual interpolation is one of my favorite things. These are great examples there. If you look, because of the closeness of the backgrounds here, a fair amount of this you can't see. You can't tell that the edges of these things actually end at the white background because they're so close in color. But your brain still guesses that they are. The human visual system will really frequently fill in the gaps. this is can be a problem, and it's also something to keep in mind when you're designing things. Uh, in a nuclear world, they're not allowed to fill in the gaps, so we have to give them all those information. So keep that in mind there. You know, peripheral vision gets filled in. A lot of that does to just try to make sense of the world you're in. So if something tends to look strange because of your perspective or anything, your brain will sometimes override it. So that's another thing to keep in mind there. And the objects on the right there are very common in most sensation and perception textbooks, where we can extrapolate what the white space images are, even though we don't have edges there. But because we have what they a surrounding area, I guess we have an edge in that instance, but we're able to kind of just fill in what we think that is. Heuristics not always being correct. This is a big one in nuclear and just kind of design in general. People's heuristics are not always correct. Often they're not very correct. So tend to try not to use them. If that's your shortcut in your design to make some future work, find a different shortcut. So in the image above, you know, if we're looking at this from our perspective here, the rope on the upper there that the red shirted individual is holding looks like it's broken. The rope is, because we can see that it doesn't line up with the other side. So B would be our perception of that. But C is equally likely impossible. And it's important to keep in mind that your perception is not very reliable most of the time on its own. It needs other information as well. The gist of a scene. So this is one of those, you know, I just love Where's Waldo books, or is an extreme example of this. But when you're looking at a scene and the gist of it is your recognition and preconceived notion of what this scene is, what's going on, what your expectations would be if you were standing in this scene. And one of those expectations probably would not be a fire hydrant on a mailbox. But it's how we would expect some of these interactions to arise, and those kind of aspects. So we deal with this every day when we're walking through life. We're constantly processing gists of various scenes, comparing it to past experience, and making a continual plan to move or to act or to do different things. Auditory perception. So visual system is the biggest one we're going to go through. We're talking a lot in this class about display design. So we'll cover the others, and they definitely are relevant. If you are super interested in some of these, I'd recommend taking sensation and perception for some of that. So wavelength of your sound is pitch, amplitude is your loudness or volume. And then this is an example that shows how amplitude or wavelength would be shown or characterized within air molecules. That is all sound is the adjustment of and volume really of air molecules going through our life. It's measured in decibels, loudness is, and it's probably the more important one. Pitch is important, but decibels is a big one because we, especially from like an ergonomics perspective, too loud, you can go deaf. So trying to think about auditory things, sometimes it'll help to, I mean, you can use this decibel meter as an example, but just what associations do we make for different sounds? You know, the louder it is, maybe, at least for me, the louder something was, the more physically demanding I used to expect it would be, just because of manual labor or machinery, those kind of things. And then also, what accommodations do we make? Think about physical accommodations in the sense of, you know, plugging your ears when something's loud, or really straining to hear something if it's really quiet. And then what accommodations would we have in a design for those things? In nuclear, we're primarily looking at alarms here. So how do you make alarms useful to the user, loud enough, not too loud. What about varying alarms? Do you have different alarms? One interesting thing there is, let's say you have an alarm that has a loud buzz or chirp or beep or anything once every 3 seconds. And then another alarm that has the same alarm cadence triggers a half second later. Then you get into this consistent situation where two of them are ringing. Which one is it? And you won't really know until you turn one off. So keep in mind those kind of things when you're designing things. How is it working? Your Windows computers are a really good example. Macs, I'm sure, are too, where there's very specific chirps for, like, if Windows is trying to give me an update or shut down my computer. Like, it makes certain noises that are kind of unique versus if you get an email, it makes a different noise. And that's one way that our world, especially digitally, has tried to accommodate those things for us. I'm not going to go too crazy into the ear. This is just the structure of it. I'm not going to test you, require you to know anything. Just be aware that in general, the exterior of your ear, your outer ear is collecting stimulus, your middle ear is focusing the stimulus, and then your inner ear is processing and handing it off to your cochlear nerve, your auditory nerve systems, and getting it prepped for processing. And the ear is very sensitive. It also there's two primary senses we're not going to deal with, at least not right now. We might run into them later, but the ear has a big part of both of them. One of them is proprioception, which is kind of how we sense ourself in the world, our sense of spatial awareness, those things. Sometimes you'll see people that don't have very good proprioception, so they will stand too close to people or run into things without really thinking about it. And also the vestibular system, which is how like motion sickness is governed. It's how we perceive upright, are we sideways, are we moving, those kind of things. Those are both heavily influenced by the ear, as the ear governs balance and those kind of things. One other thing I want to go into. So on the top right here, see how the ear is doing your detection, and then it's going up through your brainstem. This is one very specific thing that we'll get into with hearing and with smell, but just keep that in mind. They all kind of go up through the brainstem, but hearing and smell in particular have a different characteristic there. Auditory localizations. This is, we hear something, how do we know what side of us it's on? Is it in front of us, behind us, next to us, where? Our ears will both perceive a sound. There will be a distance, obviously a time distance between when one ear does and the other. And this talks about a time difference as small as 1/100,000th of a second can cause us to localize it. Keep in mind your head is a partial sound barrier. That's where we get into intensity differences. So if there's a loud noise and you're on your right and your left ear hears quieter noise, but your right ear gets the full one, then it will localize to the right. Because again, your auditory system knows your head's in the way. Another thing to keep in mind with auditory, this is why when we talk, we hear a certain voice, and then when we're recording something, we hear a different one. So I hope these are well recorded, because I will never listen to them or edit them. I despise the sound of my voice on recording. And that's not, what's important to realize is when you talk internally, you're hearing the voice or the sound your voice makes after it's been processed through bumping through your skull, which actually tends to deepen it a little bit generally. So I hear a deeper sound than what I actually sound like. That's just because we process information after it's been bounced around our skull, which has a modulating or some effect on the sound that we make. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Signal detection theory. Again, the hearing and the signal detection stuff, you will get a lot more in sensation and perception, or you'll also hear it referred to as S&P. But we'll go through some basics. So it's essentially signal versus noise. How the signal is what we're looking for, the noise is everything else. How do we adequately identify and attenuate the noises we're supposed to, or the stimuli we're supposed to, without having false alarms or misses. Um, D prime there, that is a specific mathematical calculation that you can do to identify how close it is, which then has between signal and noise, which also will identify your likelihood of detection. So now how do we override signal detection theory? So it's not 100% that, oh yes, the likelihood that someone's going to detect this is X, and that'll always be that way because we did this math. Not really. People have a pretty wide range of control over their sensory organs, sensory processing, and just processing in general. So a pizza delivery example, which Dr. Dyer used to use actually, was he's sitting there, he's watching a football game or some kind of sporting game, and but he knows he ordered pizza. So, but the game's pretty loud. So if he primes that he's listening for his doorbell, and that's something that he's thinking of. This is another thing. If you've ever heard your phone vibrate in a busy situation, maybe you're attenuated to that and you're trying to listen for it. A pizza delivery example is the same way, and you can increase your likelihood there. And your association, I put in here association supremacy. That's more one of my terms, not anything else. But as we associate sounds with different things, we can give it a level of supremacy over the actual stimulus we're receiving, which is a way that we can kind of override signal and noise. So in a nuclear world, if there's a very specific alarm that means a specific thing, and they're worried about that for some reason, they might hyper attenuate to that. The good news is that increases a hit chance if that triggers and decreases the miss, but it also might increase the miss for other stimuli. We'll get into it when we get into cognition with attention, but we can't have the same diligence on all things at all times. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Touch, so won't go very much into this. Shouldn't come up a lot in nuclear. Hopefully, I guess it's probably bad if you're having warmth, cold, or pain in the nuclear control room. But those are our 4 touch senses, our touch functions by pressure, warmth, cold, and pain. I did put in here that you can sense bumps as small as 1 micrometer tall. Think about Braille. Our ability to detect with touch is extremely capable and extremely accurate. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. That's why we have little bumps that orient us on most dials or keyboards or various things. Your phones, well, phones when they have buttons, I guess. So that's one thing to keep in mind there. Smell. So it's linked to taste, obviously. Poisons are a concern. That's why I smell, that's why we can smell so many things, is to smell poison, to smell predators, to smell things that are wrong. Possibly more primal and therefore linked to memory. So I talked about how you got to watch where your the senses process. Smell processes in the deeper parts of the brain, the areas that we link with more primal or autonomic or automatic functions that we take. This could be an explanation for why sense memory is so strong with smell, because it's linked with those primal areas. Maybe its encoding with memory is a lot stronger, a lot faster, those kind of things there. But that's one thing to keep in mind. There are many different types of smells, and this kind of explains the process there. There's a lot of different really strange things with smells relative to all the other senses. So it's an interesting thing to study there. We're not going to go into taste. Again, I hope no one's licking a switch in a nuclear control room that's 70 years old. So taste, sour, sweet, that stuff. We don't need to really go into that too much. So we have a little bit of time left here. How do we make sense of an information-rich environment? And we'll end at this slide for this week. So competing sensory inputs is an example of a actual nuclear control screen or representational screen. So how are we? How do we deal with this? Or this could also work in a busy public space environment. You know, primacy. What's most important? What are the things that stand out the most? Do you have an association that's going to, through top-down processing, govern how your stimuli is going to operate and how your stimuli is going to be handled? Schemas. Is there a script or a set of rules you're supposed to be following here? And memory and priority, these two feed into primacy. Is this a situation where you've experienced it before? Is it super important? Or is it really not, whatever's going on? Oh, I've seen this forever. I've interacted with one set of users where they were looking for anomalies and graphs and then different charts of parameters or variables. And one of their solutions to having to grapple with this immense amount of variables was they ran a script that would generate graphs for approximately 900 to 1,000 variables. So 900 to 1,000 images that they would have to process through. And then as they would scroll through them, it takes them like 20, 30 minutes. They're only looking at each one for half a second maybe. But all they're looking at is differences. They have a mental representation of where things should be. Are these matching those? And that's kind of an interesting hack to get around and to get around the volume that they had to just kind of interpret every day. And also they were leaning on one of our most powerful processing tools in our visual system. So that's an interesting thing to think about as we look at design and different tasking. So yeah, we're gonna stop there. And then again, if you have any questions or anything, let me know. Or if you need anything there. I know I have a couple things I have to get to a few of you, so sorry about that. Be patient, and I look forward to seeing all the Slacks. Thanks, guys.